Hi, I'm Andrew from Parlogram, and in this video I'm taking you back to December 1965. The Beatles are at the peak of their fame. They have a brand new album and a new single at the top of the charts. They dominate radio, television and record shops. But if you look a little closer, something isn't right. On stage, things are beginning to fall apart. They can't hear themselves, they can't hear each other, and more often than not, the audience can't properly hear the music either. Nobody involved at the time believed this was a farewell. There were no announcements, no speeches, no sense of an ending. But in hindsight, this brief series of concerts, only 9 nights in December 1965, was something altogether different. It was the last time the Beatles would ever tour their own country. In this video, we're going back to those 9 extraordinary nights, using the most valuable evidence we have, contemporary newspaper reports written by journalists who were actually there, to understand what it really felt like inside those halls, and why this brief tour unknowingly became a kind of quiet farewell to Beatlemania in Britain. Rehearsals for the tour began in late November 1965 at the Donmar Rehearsal Theatre in London, the same venue the group had previously used when preparing for their UK breakthrough appearance on Sunday night at the London Palladium in October 1963. Very few photographs of the group rehearsing still exist, which make these images taken by Robert Whittaker all the more precious. On December the 1st, the band held an open final rehearsal at Neil Aspinall's home, before heading north to Glasgow for the tour's opening night. The tour ran from the 2nd to the 12th of December 1965, 18 shows across 9 venues, from Glasgow through the Midlands and the North, and finally in London and Cardiff. Their set comprised 11 songs: I Feel Fine, She's a Woman, If I Needed Someone, Act Naturally, Nowhere Man, Babies in Black, Help, We Can Work It Out, Yesterday, Day Tripper, and I'm Down. The problem was that the music they were now making didn't come across on stage as effectively as their earlier songs had. Much of its subtlety and detail was simply lost beneath the screaming, and the sound systems in the theatres and cinemas where they were performing just weren't up to the task. Every night was a major operation, not just for the performers on the bill, but also for the police, ambulance crews and security services trying to keep control of what followed the Beatles from city to city. As was customary before a Beatles concert, Tony Barrow organised a press conference, during which Paul appeared wearing a large tie that John promptly used as a handkerchief. That afternoon, the band also recorded a brief spoken message backstage for the brand new pirate station Radio Scotland, as they settled in for what would be a very long evening. Mike Ledgerwood, reporting for Disc Weekly, described the backstage mood as relaxed, with the Beatles, joined by Moody Blues member Ray Thomas, watching the latest episode of The Avengers on television, which incidentally would have been Dial a Deadly Number. Outside, some 600 police officers and 130 first aid and ambulance staff had been drafted in to control a crowd of around 6,000 fans. Among them was John's cousin Stanley, who'd arrived as a surprise visitor, only to be given a hard time by security who had no idea who he was. Also appearing on the bill were the Paramounts, Beryl Marsden, Steve Aldo, the Cougars, the Marionettes, and, most significantly for Paul McCartney, the Moody Blues, fronted at the time by Denny Laine. Earlier that same year, they'd scored a huge #1 with Go Now, and for a brief moment in 1965 were one of the hottest groups in the country. Just a few years later, Denny Laine would of course reappear alongside Paul McCartney as a member of Wings. The first of the 2 shows that evening began at 6:15 and was beset by problems with the amplification equipment. However, these issues were resolved by the time the band returned for the second show at 9. Record Mirror noted how warmly the newer material was received, especially Nowhere Man. The performance of their brand new single was reportedly met with no resistance from the public at all. Despite the best efforts of security, 65 fans fainted during the first show alone, with several taken to hospital. Dozens more similar incidents occurred during the second performance, And this was only the first night of the tour. Screaming had always been a part of Beatles concerts, but by this point it had reached a level where it overwhelmed almost everything else. Mike Ledgerwood's Newcastle report captures that perfectly. He describes the noise as deafening, nearly 2,000 voices at full volume before a note is even heard. Once the performance begins, it turns physical. Sweets, paper, toys and autograph books are hurled towards the stage. Then comes one of those details you almost wouldn't believe if it wasn't in print: a red jelly baby bouncing off John's head. Beatles concerts had long since ceased being conventional musical performances. They'd become endurance tests. As John would later say, they often only knew which song they were playing by watching each other's hands. Yet even in the middle of that chaos, there are still extraordinary moments. For the first time, this tour featured something the Beatles had never previously had on stage: a Vox Continental organ. John plays it during We Can Work It Out, but something very unusual happens on the following song. Unlike today and almost every other performance of yesterday, Paul does not play the song on the acoustic guitar. Instead, he performs it on the Vox organ. Newspaper reports describe how the crowd noise drops as he makes his way over to it. And remarkably, for that brief moment amid all the hysteria, the audience actually listens. Normal service resumes with Day Tripper, followed by the closing number I'm Down. Beatles fever, the paper concludes. They've done it again.
Oh dear, what can I do?
For the Beatles, this concert carried a very different weight. This was home. Disc Weekly notes that Beatlemania was still very much alive. Of the 40,000 people who applied for tickets, only 5,000 were successful. Meanwhile, the Cavern Club, where it had all begun, was under threat of closure. Liverpool City Council had ordered owner Ray McFall to install a new drainage system costing £3,000, a sum he simply couldn't afford. Although Paul was sympathetic, the others remained unmoved. John's words were revealing. Emotionally, he admitted, the allegiance was still there, but physically they owed the Cavern nothing. The club finally closed the following year. The audience inside the Empire included George and Ringo's parents, Paul's father Jim, and George's soon-to-be wife Pattie Boyd. Aside from the usual jelly babies and dancing in the aisles, there was little of note to report crowd-wise. First aid workers described the evening as a picnic, dealing with just 17 cases of hysteria. Offstage, a very different picture emerges of life on the road. The papers describe long journeys through snow, endless travel, and evenings that now end not in nightclubs but in hotel rooms, playing records, eating, and simply trying to rest. Perhaps the most revealing comment of the entire tour comes from George Harrison. In hindsight, he would become one of the strongest advocates for abandoning touring altogether. And here, in 1965, you can already hear the start of that change. He tells a journalist that they've enjoyed making records and writing far more this year than going on the road. Tour promoter Arthur Howes had hoped to persuade the band to add another show on December the 6th in Leicester, Bristol or Leeds. The Beatles refused, choosing instead to take a rare rest day. After their day off, the Beatles travelled to Manchester. Thick fog turned a normally quick 35-mile journey into a 4-hour ordeal, and they arrived at the venue 12 minutes after they were due on stage. It's easy to forget just how different Britain looked and smelled in 1965. In cities like Manchester, winter air pollution was still severe enough that people sometimes wore protective masks. This now famous image of the Beatles wearing masks during this tour isn't just playful Beatle humour, it's a quiet snapshot of the Britain they travelled through night after night. After the concert, they met with A Hard Day's Night producer Walter Shenson to discuss plans for a third film, a western titled A Talent for Loving. That night, they decided that the project was not for them. bad weather continued to plague the tour as they travelled to the Gaumont Cinema in Sheffield on the 8th of December and then onto the Odeon Cinema in Birmingham the following day. Heavy rain and thick fog delayed their journey from Sheffield to Birmingham, causing them to arrive 10 minutes late for the first show. As a result, the support acts were forced to extend their sets. Their final London concerts were originally planned for the Royal Albert Hall and Empire Pool Wembley, but in the end, 2 different venues were chosen.
1, 2, 3, 4.
This venue holds particular significance in the story of the final UK tour. Not only is Hammersmith where most of the surviving photographs and that brief fragment of amateur film were taken, but it was also the site of their 1964 Christmas show, a rare moment in their career when they repeated themselves. From Hammersmith, the tour moved just a few miles across London to the Astoria, where the Beatles had performed their 1963 Christmas show and supported Helen Shapiro earlier that same year. Helen Shapiro attended the concert and visited the band backstage, along with John Mouse and Gary Leeds of the Walker Brothers. On the final day of the tour, the Beatles began with an interview for a local BBC television reporter in the foyer of the Capitol Theatre. The 2 shows at 5:30 p.m. and 8 p.m. followed the same pattern as the previous 17. To the audience, it was simply another Beatles concert. There was no farewell speech, no announcement, no sense that anything historic was happening. When the final chord of I'm Down faded, they simply walked off the stage. Apart from an appearance at the NME Poll Winners concert at Wembley on the 1st of May 1966, this was the last time the Beatles performed in front of a paying audience in Britain. So, that was December 1965. 18 shows, 9 cities. The final UK tour of the most famous band in the world. At the time, it felt like business as usual. Another run of packed halls, another wave of headlines, another burst of noise. But history rarely announces itself as it happens. Only later does it become clear that this was the moment something ended. Not with a statement or a farewell performance, but quietly, almost unnoticed. Although the Beatles would tour Germany, Japan and the United States over the following months, the conditions that made touring possible, musically, physically and emotionally, were already gone. And when they finally walked off the stage at Candlestick Park in August 1966, the decision to stop touring altogether simply confirmed what had already begun here. December 1965 wasn't a goodbye in name, but it was one in reality. A final journey around Britain by a band already beginning to outgrow the stage, and turning instead towards the studio, where the next chapter of their story would be written. If you enjoyed this deep dive, do let me know in the comments. And if you or someone in your family was actually there in December 1965, I would genuinely love to hear your memories. But that's all for this one, so I'll say bye for now and thanks for watching.